There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Not the loud moments, not the ones people make speeches about or photograph for memory. The quiet ones. The ones where a room full of people laughs at you and something inside you either shatters or hardens into steel. Bailey Whitmore had always believed, deep down, that she was the kind of woman who would shatter. She was wrong. The Kesler Foundation Gala was the kind of event that existed to remind people of their place. Held every autumn in the grand ballroom of the Hotel Imperia on Fifth Avenue, it was a cathedral of old money and new ambition, 12 chandeliers dripping with crystal, tables draped in ivory linen, a guest list curated like a weapon. Investment bankers, philanthropists, the occasional senator, and always, tucked in the corners like shadows with excellent tailoring, the men whose money moved through channels that no foundation dinner would ever openly acknowledge. Bailey had not wanted to come. She had been very clear about that. But her boss, Marcus Fenwick of Fenwick & Associates PR, had been equally clear that the foundation's account was worth $4 million annually to the firm, and that Bailey, as their top crisis communications strategist, was expected to be present, visible, and charming. He had said it with the particular smile of a man who had never once in his life been made to feel that his body was the most interesting thing about him. She had worn the burgundy gown. She'd spent 3 weeks finding it, had driven to 4 different boutiques, had stood in fitting rooms under fluorescent lights that turned everyone into a version of themselves they didn't recognize, and she had found it, structured silk, off the shoulder, dramatic in the way that said she had chosen this on purpose. She had done her hair herself, a crown of thick natural coils pinned high, gold earrings that caught the light. She had looked in the mirror before leaving her apartment and thought, good. This is good. You are enough for any room. The room did not immediately agree. It wasn't violent. That was the thing about cruelty in expensive spaces, it never announced itself. It arrived in increments. The coat check attendant who looked at her twice before reaching for her wrap. The table seating that placed her at the edge of the room, near the service corridor, despite her firm's contribution level. The woman in emerald Valentino, Sylvia Hartwell, wife of the foundation's board chairman, who looked at Bailey when she sat down and said, loud enough for the adjacent table to hear, "Oh, I didn't realize Fenwick's was sending their whole team tonight. Is there a +1 policy now?" She laughed. 3 people laughed with her. The sound was light and glass-edged and it cut exactly as it was meant to. Bailey smiled. She said nothing. She reached for her water glass and she took a slow, measured sip, and she told herself what she always told herself in these moments, you are here to do a job. Focus on the job. But the job, for the first hour, offered no protection. Marcus had vanished into a cluster of board members almost immediately. The man seated to Bailey's left was involved in a conversation about a yacht that did not seem to require her participation. The woman to her right spent 45 minutes on her phone. Bailey ate the amuse-bouche. She smiled at the server. She read the program twice. She was very, very good at being invisible when the room had already decided to see through her. It was during the cocktail portion, just before the formal dinner service, that the second thing happened. She had stepped away from the table to find Marcus, walking toward the far side of the ballroom where the bar wrapped the length of one wall. She was passing a table of men, 5 of them, dark suits, the quiet kind of expensive that didn't need to announce itself, when her heel caught the edge of the carpet runner and she stumbled. Not a fall. A lurch, graceless and sudden, one hand catching the back of an empty chair. She righted herself immediately. But not before 2 of the men at that table laughed. Not the polite, reflexive kind. The deliberate kind. The kind where one man leans toward another and says something low, and both of them find it worth repeating. She didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The shape of the laughter was enough, the way it turned her stumble into a punchline about her body, about her presence in this room, about the fundamental absurdity, to these men, of a woman who looked like Bailey existing in a space that looked like this. She kept walking. Her face did not change. Her stride did not falter. But one person at that table had not laughed. He had not smiled. He had not looked away politely, the way people sometimes did when they wanted to communicate distance from cruelty without actually creating it. He had simply gone still. The way a man goes still when he is deciding something. Bailey did not see this. She had already moved past the table. She found Marcus, delivered the message she'd been sent to relay, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and returned to her seat. The rest of the cocktail hour passed. The dinner service began. The speeches started. She was composing a mental draft of the report she'd submit Monday morning, calculating exactly how early she could leave without it being remarked upon, when the chair beside her, the one that had been empty all evening, was pulled back, and someone sat down. She turned, expecting a late-arriving board member. The man who had sat down was not a board member. She knew who Tamor Azerov was the way most people in certain professional circles knew, not from direct contact, but from the specific kind of care with which his name was not spoken. He was 38, Russian-born, and the sole operating heir to a financial empire that had survived 3 federal investigations, 2 hostile restructurings, and the kind of reputational events that would have destroyed any ordinary institution. He was 6'2" with the posture of someone who had decided at a young age that he would occupy whatever space he chose and that this decision would not be up for discussion. His face was angular and still, dark eyes that processed information without broadcasting it, a mouth that seemed to have a complicated relationship with smiling. He had brought 2 glasses of wine with him. He set one in front of Bailey without asking. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You were at that table," she said. Not an accusation. A statement. "I was," he said. His English carried the faint architecture of Russian, not an accent exactly, more like the memory of one, the way a language shapes a mouth even after it's been translated away. "You didn't laugh." "No." She studied him for a moment. In her professional life, Bailey had negotiated with hostile executives, managed the fallout from corporate scandals, and sat across tables from men who had spent their entire careers developing techniques for making people feel small. She was not easily unsettled. But there was something about the directness of this man, the complete absence of performance, that made her recalibrate. "What do you want?" she asked. Something moved across his face. Not offense. Something closer to recognition. "The same thing you do," he said. "To get through this evening." She picked up the wine glass. "Then we understand each other." She did not know, in that moment, that she had just said the most consequential sentence of her life. His name was not on her table assignment. He had simply moved there, and no one at the Kesler Foundation Gala was going to tell Tamor Azerov where to sit. He owned the building the Foundation's accounting firm operated out of. He had donated, through 3 different shell entities, more to the Foundation's endowment than its 3 largest public donors combined. He was, in the ecosystem of this ballroom, apex. And he had chosen to sit beside a woman who had just been publicly mocked, not as an act of charity, not as a strategic maneuver, but because watching what happened at that table had done something to him that he was still, quietly, trying to understand. They talked during dinner. Not the way strangers at galas talk, not the careful, interchangeable conversation about markets and travel and mutual connections. They talked the way people talk when they are both, for different reasons, slightly outside the room they are physically inside. He asked about her work, and when she described it, he actually listened, not with the face of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with the focused attention of someone for whom information is a serious currency. She found herself being more honest than she intended about the frustrations of the industry, about what it cost to be constantly excellent in spaces that had already decided what they thought of you before you opened your mouth. He said very little about himself. What he said was precise. She had the sense of a man who measured his words the way a jeweler measured weight, every one of them exactly what was intended, not a fraction more. "You knew those men," she said at one point. "At the table." "Business associates," he said. "And you sat here anyway." He turned to look at her fully then. It was the first time he had done that, turned and looked without the slight angle of peripheral attention he'd maintained. His eyes were very dark and completely steady. "I sat here," he said, "because I wanted to." The dinner ended. The speeches concluded. The dancing began, a string quartet segueing into something warmer, the floor filling with couples and clusters, the ballroom transforming into the softer, looser version of itself that came after the formal program. Bailey was calculating her exit when Marcus appeared, flushed and slightly unsteady, to tell her that their contact with the Foundation's communications director had just introduced him to Senator Aldridge, and could Bailey please come handle this because the senator was very interested in discussing their firm's crisis response capacity and Marcus had had 4 glasses of champagne. She went. She handled it. The senator was engaged and intelligent and the conversation ran 40 minutes, during which Bailey outlined a complete strategic communications framework from memory while standing in heeled shoes that were becoming increasingly relevant to her attention. When it concluded and the senator's aide appeared to redirect him, Bailey finally began moving toward the coat check. She was almost there when she heard it. She didn't mean to hear it. She was passing an alcove near the ballroom's entrance, one of those ornate recessed spaces with a velvet settee meant for the kind of private conversations that gala organizers wisely provided for. Sylvia Hartwell was inside it, with 2 women Bailey recognized as board members' wives, and Sylvia's voice carried with the confidence of a woman who had never considered the acoustics of any room she was standing in. "I'm just saying, Marcus must be paying her significantly because otherwise, who sends someone like that to represent the firm? I mean, she's clearly competent, I'll grant that, but at a certain point presentation matters." Bailey stopped. She should not have stopped. Every protocol of self-preservation told her to keep walking, to collect her wrap, to get into the car she'd pre-booked and drive back to her apartment and spend Sunday recovering her sense of self from the small cuts this evening had administered. She knew this. She stopped anyway. And then something happened that she did not expect, could not have anticipated, and would spend a significant amount of time afterward trying to find the rational explanation for. Tamor Azerov came to stand beside her. He had been perhaps 20 feet away, in conversation with a man Bailey didn't recognize, and somehow, without her noticing the moment of decision, he was now beside her in the corridor, close enough that she could feel the deliberate steadiness of him, and he was looking at the alcove where Sylvia Hartwell was still speaking, and his expression was the most unreadable thing Bailey had ever tried to read. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Excuse me?" "Not away from this." He said it with extraordinary calm. "Into it." She stared at him. "Azerov." The voice came from inside the alcove. Sylvia had emerged slightly, noticed him, and her entire register shifted into the bright, anxious warmth of a woman who understood exactly who she was looking at. "I didn't realize you were still, we were just." "I heard," he said. He said it simply, without drama, and somehow the simplicity was the thing that made Sylvia Hartwell's smile go fragile at the edges. He turned to Bailey. And then he did something that later, reconstructing the evening, she would return to again and again, testing it from different angles to see if it could be explained as calculation or performance. He offered her his arm. In the old, formal way, elbows slightly bent, a wordless invitation that contained within it a very specific social statement about whose side he was standing on. Bailey looked at his arm. She looked at his face. She saw nothing in it that looked like pity. She took his arm. They walked into the alcove together. What followed lasted perhaps 4 minutes and would be discussed among certain circles of New York society for considerably longer. Tamor Azerov did not raise his voice. He did not make threats, not explicit ones. What he did was something far more surgical. He spoke to Sylvia Hartwell and her companions as though Bailey were exactly who she was, the most professionally accomplished person in the room, an invited guest of the Foundation, a woman whose presence was unremarkable except in all the ways that actually mattered, and he did it with the complete authority of a man whose opinion structured reality for everyone in that alcove. He mentioned, in passing, that he'd found Bailey's analysis of the Foundation's communications strategy during dinner to be the most substantive conversation he'd had all evening. He mentioned, also in passing, that he was considering directing some of his philanthropic giving through a firm with strong crisis communications capacity. He allowed a silence after that to do the work that explicit statements could not. Sylvia Hartwell said it had been a lovely evening. Her companions agreed. They excused themselves with the careful speed of people who understand when a field has shifted beneath them. When they were gone, Bailey slowly uncurled her fingers from his arm. She was shaking slightly. Not from distress, or not only from distress. There was something else underneath it, something that felt uncomfortably like the pressure of being seen. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I could have handled it." "I know that too." She turned to look at him. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. In the background, the string quartet played something slow and aching that neither of them acknowledged. "Because I was already there," he said finally. "And it seemed like the right thing to do." It was not a satisfying answer. It was also, she would later realize, a completely honest one. She should have left after that. She had more than enough reason to collect her things and go, to let the evening end on the complicated, ambiguous note it had reached. Instead, she found herself accepting when he suggested they get coffee, not in the hotel's restaurant, which was still full of gala guests, but at a place 3 blocks north he apparently knew, a small Hungarian cafe that was open late and populated, at this hour, almost entirely by chess players and insomniacs. They sat across from each other at a small table with a checked cloth and ordered espresso, and the conversation that followed was entirely different from the one at dinner. There was no performance to maintain. The gala was behind them. And somewhere in the 4 blocks between the Imperia's entrance and the cafe's door, something had shifted between them in a way that neither of them commented on because commenting would have required acknowledging it. He told her about Moscow. About the particular quality of winter mornings there, the way the city looked when snow compressed the sound of it. He did not explain how he had come to New York, but she heard in his language around it the shape of a story that involved necessity and reinvention and the particular kind of loss that restructures a person entirely without destroying them. She told him about growing up in Baltimore. About her mother, who had worked doubles at a hotel not unlike the one they just left, cleaning rooms with the same efficiency and invisible grace with which Bailey now managed crises. About the scholarship that had sent her to Georgetown and the particular shock of discovering that being excellent was not, in certain rooms, considered sufficient, that there were additional requirements, unwritten and unspoken, that changed depending on who you were. "You are used to performing," he said. "Not critically. Observationally." "So are you," she said. He considered this. "Yes. But I chose what I perform. Everyone thinks they choose. Some people have more options than others." "That's true," she said. And then, because it felt honest, "Tonight was not a good night for me to feel that." He nodded. He didn't apologize or minimize or offer the reflexive reassurance that people who feel guilty about the advantages of their position sometimes give. He just nodded, and somehow that was the right response. They were there for 2 hours. When they finally stood to leave, the cafe had emptied almost completely. The night had turned colder, and when they stood on the sidewalk, their breath showed in the air between them. "Can I call you a car?" he asked. "I have one booked." "Bailey." He said her name like he'd been using it for years. "This evening, I know it wasn't simple. Very few things worth anything are." He looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had, the way that felt like complete attention rather than just direction of gaze. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a card. Not a business card, something heavier, cream-colored, with only a phone number in clean type. "If you want to talk again," he said. She took it. She did not make promises about whether she would use it, because she was not sure what answer was true, and she had spent enough of the evening in rooms where people said things that were not true. She called the car. He waited until it arrived, standing at a slight distance, not performing courtesy but simply, present. When she got in, she looked back once through the window. He was still standing there, one hand in his pocket, watching the car until it turned the corner. She did not call the number for 6 days. On the 7th day, she did. She would tell herself later that it was professional curiosity, that his mention of redirecting philanthropic giving through a communications firm was worth exploring. This was technically true in the way that many convenient explanations are technically true. The actual reason was that she had thought about him, carefully and against her better judgment, every day for a week, and had finally run out of arguments against calling. He answered on the second ring. "I wasn't sure you would call," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she said. They met for lunch. Then for dinner. Then for a Saturday afternoon at an exhibition at the Met that she'd mentioned almost in passing and he had remembered with the precision of a man who collected information about things that interested him. In the spaces between, they talked by phone, not the performative checking in of people who are uncertain of each other's interest, but actual conversations that sometimes ran late and resolved nothing and were exactly what they were. She learned things about him in pieces. That he ran 3 legitimate businesses with the same focused intensity he apparently brought to the other dimensions of his life. That he had a loyalty to the people in his inner circle that was absolute and cost him. That he read, seriously, widely, across languages, and that books were one of the few things he allowed himself to be enthusiastic about without reservation. That he could be funny, in a dry and unexpected way that always caught her off guard. That he watched her with an attention that she had initially interpreted as strategic and was increasingly having to revise that interpretation. She did not ask directly about the other things. She knew what she knew. In her work, she had enough proximity to crisis and reputation management to understand the landscape. But she also knew that the world was not divided cleanly into the people who operated inside its official structures and the people who operated outside them, and that the line between those categories was drawn differently depending on who was drawing it and what they needed it to say. What she knew about Tamor Azerov was this: he was careful, he was honest within his own definitions of honesty, and he had never once, in any of their conversations, made her feel like anything other than someone worth being extremely honest with. This made him, in her experience, genuinely unusual. The complication came on a Tuesday evening in early November, when she arrived at the restaurant where they'd agreed to meet and found him already there, not at their usual table, but standing near the entrance with 2 men she didn't recognize and a look on his face that she had learned to identify as managed. Controlled in the specific way that control is applied when something requires it. He came to her immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "I need to ask you something before we go in." "What is it?" "The man at the far table, to the left of the bar. Do you know who that is?" She looked. 50s, silver-haired, expensive watch, the kind of ease that came from never having been made uncomfortable in a public place. "No. His name is Colton Vreeland. He runs a private equity firm. He is also, through connections I would rather not detail in an entryway, attempting to acquire certain financial instruments connected to my operations through a proxy that does not legally exist on paper." He paused. "He does not know who you are. He does not know what you mean to me. What he does know is that I am here tonight and he intends to approach me." The word "mean" stopped her. Not the context. The word. "What do you need?" she asked. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who had expected to have to spend longer arriving at this point. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said. "But if you'd prefer to leave, I understand that entirely." She was quiet for a moment. "If I stay, what does that tell him?" "That I am not conducting business tonight. That this is personal time. That approaching me would be a miscalculation." "And is that true? That this is personal time?" He said it like the question was simple. "Yes. Entirely." She thought about risk calculations. She thought about the boundaries of what she knew and what she was choosing to know. She thought about a night 3 weeks ago when she'd called him at 11 p.m. from a work situation that had gone sideways and he had listened for 40 minutes and said exactly 3 sentences, all of them useful. "Buy me a better table," she said. Something happened to his face. It was not a smile exactly, it was the precursor to one, a small, involuntary release of tension. "Done," he said. The dinner with Vreeland's attempted approach in the background was strange and oddly intimate. The low-grade awareness of the external pressure made the space between them feel more deliberate, like a room with the windows sealed against weather. Vreeland did approach, briefly, and Tamor stood, spoke to him in a tone that was perfectly civil and entirely impenetrable, and returned to the table without explaining and without continuing the thread of their conversation where it had left off, which was itself a form of protection. Afterward, on the sidewalk, he said, "You understood what that was." "Yes," she said. "And you stayed." "I stayed." He was quiet. Then, Bailey. Just her name. The way he said it, like it was something he was allowing himself. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. Not yet. Because she knew what she was feeling and she knew it was real, and she also knew that real things, in her experience, required more time than 3 weeks and one difficult dinner to be spoken aloud without collapsing under their own weight. She needed to know what she was choosing. She needed to choose it clearly. He nodded. He did not push. What she did over the next 2 weeks was what she was good at. She gathered information. Not by asking him, she didn't violate the unspoken architecture of what they were to each other, but through the professional channels available to someone in crisis communications who knew which questions unlocked which databases. She read. She analyzed. She sat with what she found and she asked herself what it changed and what it didn't. What she found was a man who was, by any conventional legal standard, operating a complex financial organization that existed in the space between multiple jurisdictions' definitions of legitimate. What she also found was a man whose personal record contained zero violence. Whose name appeared in sealed federal documents not as a target but as a witness who had cooperated. Whose known associates included people who had been protected, quietly, when they needed protection. Whose word, according to 3 different people in 3 different conversations that she engineered carefully, was considered unbreakable. It did not make him simple. It did not make the choice simple. It made her realize that she had already made the choice and was now doing the forensic work of understanding why. She told him on a Saturday, in the cafe where they'd first had coffee, the Hungarian place with the chess players, which had become, by some unspoken agreement, their place. She told him that she knew more than she'd said she knew. She told him that she was not asking him to explain or justify it, because she understood that explanation and justification weren't the right frameworks. She told him that she was a professional who worked inside systems and she could not pretend otherwise, and that this created a tension she was not going to minimize. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to know?" "Nothing I'd have to pretend I don't know later." He nodded slowly. "Then here is what I can tell you that falls within that boundary. I am careful. I do not involve people and things without their full understanding. I protect what is mine. And you," he paused. "You are not a liability to me. You are not a strategic asset. You are the person I look forward to most in every week that I have talked to you. That is unprecedented for me and I am not interested in managing it away." The silence after that was the kind that required no management. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Okay," she said again. And then, because it was honest, "I'm terrified." "So am I," he said. And the thing was, she believed him. What happened in the following months was not simple and was not always comfortable and was, in the aggregate, the most genuinely real experience of her adult life. They argued about structure and vulnerability and the particular ways in which they had each built elaborate systems for not needing people. He pushed back when she used professional distance as emotional distance, which he could always identify. She pushed back when he made unilateral decisions that affected things adjacent to her life, which he had a tendency to do with the confidence of a man who had always been the decision-maker in every room. They found, gradually, the language of each other. The threat, when it came from the direction she hadn't been watching. It came in the form of a journalist, Mara Lindqvist, a sharp and ambitious investigative reporter at a publication with considerable reach, who had been working a piece on the financial networks of New York's less visible power structures. She had, through means that Tamor's people were still tracing, obtained photographs. Not damning photographs, nothing criminal. But photographs of the 2 of them together, over several months, with a suggested narrative that framed Bailey as a cover or an access point. A human interest angle to make a financial story land harder. Tamor found out on a Thursday. He told Bailey on a Thursday evening, sitting across from her in her apartment, her space, her territory, which he always acknowledged by asking rather than assuming. The story, he told her, was intended to run in 8 days. Its effect would be to imply, not state, that Bailey's firm had been used to launder reputational concerns for his financial network. It would not destroy her career. It would damage it significantly, and in the specific way that damaged things were hardest to repair, through implication rather than fact, through the smoke smell of association. Bailey was very quiet for a long time. "I can stop it," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "There are ways." "Legal ways?" A pause. "Mostly." She stood up. She walked to the window. 8 floors down, New York continued its indifferent operation. "Don't," she said. "Bailey. Don't." She turned around. "If you stop it that way, then the story becomes true. Do you understand what I mean? Not legally. Truthfully. If you use the mechanisms you have access to suppress a story about us because it's inconvenient, then everything she's implying becomes accurate. About what this is. About what I am in relation to it." He was silent. "I'll handle it," she said. "It's not your problem to. It is my problem. It is literally my profession." She met his eyes. "Trust me." Another silence. This one longer. "I don't do that easily," he said. "I know. Do it anyway." What she did over the following 7 days was the most technically precise crisis management of her career. She did not suppress the story. She got ahead of it. She contacted Mara Lindqvist directly, professionally, without hostility, offering an on-record statement that was carefully calibrated to reframe the narrative before it published. She documented her professional relationship with every client she'd worked with in the past 3 years, establishing a transparent record that made the implication of bias incoherent. She spoke, on background, to 2 editors at competing publications who owed her, about the actual facts of her biography and credentials. She did not ask Tamor for anything except to stay out of it. He stayed out of it. She knew what that cost him. The story ran on a Tuesday. It was a third the length it would have been, and it contained 3 on-record statements from people in Bailey's professional network that effectively neutralized its central implication before the first comment was posted. Mara Lindqvist had been good enough to recognize when she'd been outmaneuvered by someone more skilled. The follow-up from Bailey's firm was favorable. Marcus Fenwick, who had learned about the situation 48 hours before publication, had been visibly frightened and then visibly awed. On Tuesday evening, Tamor called. "It's done," she said. "I know. I've been watching." And? A pause. And then, in the voice of a man who was not accustomed to this particular feeling, "I was wrong, earlier this year. I told you that you were the most professionally accomplished person at that gala." That was an understatement. She laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it. "You're only realizing that now?" "No," he said. "I'm only saying it now." She was quiet for a moment. "Tamor." "Yes." "Come over." He was there in 20 minutes. What was said that night, and what was not said, and the long conversation that extended into the very early hours of the next morning, none of that is anyone else's story. What is necessary to know is that something resolved. Not perfectly, not without the full awareness of its complications, but genuinely, in the way that real things resolve when 2 people who have both spent their entire lives being careful finally decide, together, to be something other than careful. The gala came around again. 1 year later. The Kesler Foundation's autumn event, same hotel, same chandeliers, same careful architecture of hierarchy and display. This time, Bailey received the invitation addressed to her directly. This time, she was on the Foundation's Communications Advisory Board, a position she had earned through a year of contract work that spoke entirely for itself. She wore midnight blue. Her hair again high, gold again at her ears, and this time a ring on her left hand that was neither small nor apologetic about what it meant. Tamor Azerov was not a man who made announcements. He had told her once that the loudest thing a person could do was simply act with absolute certainty, and let the world spend its energy catching up. They had been married for 3 weeks, quietly, in a civil ceremony attended by the 12 people in the world whose presence they had both actively wanted, in a room that had nothing to prove. No announcement. No photographs released. No statement. The ballroom understood anyway. These things always surfaced. And the particular way they surfaced, not through a press release but through the simple, visible fact of Bailey moving through this room with the settled authority of a woman who had decided exactly who she was and whose arm she would take while being it, was the kind of communication that Bailey, professionally, knew was the most durable kind. Sylvia Hartwell was there. She saw Bailey across the room and her face did something complicated and private before she smiled. Bailey smiled back. It was gracious and meant nothing at all. The evening moved the way formal evenings moved, speeches, service, music, the slow warming of a room as the formality relaxed. She was talking with the Foundation's new communications director, midway through a genuinely interesting conversation about long-term institutional positioning, when Tamor appeared at her side. He did not interrupt. He waited for a natural pause, and when she half-turned toward him, he offered his arm in the old, formal way, elbow slightly bent, the same wordless gesture as a year ago in a corridor outside an alcove. She took it. She felt the same thing she had felt the first time, the complete absence of pity. Enjoying yourself? He asked. More than last year, she said. That's a low bar. Much more than last year, then. The director excused himself. They were briefly alone at the edge of the room, the chandeliers above them catching the light in 12 falling cascades, the music shifting into something slow enough to dance to. 1 year ago, he said. 14 months, she corrected. You're counting. I'm precise. It's professional. He looked at her, the full attention look that she had not, in 14 months, become entirely accustomed to, and suspected she was not meant to. You changed something, he said. Not sentimentally. As a statement of fact, which was the only register in which he operated when he meant things completely. So did you, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I don't say that about many things. I know you don't. The music continued. Neither of them moved toward the dance floor. They stood at the edge of the room they had both returned to, on entirely different terms than the ones they'd arrived on, and that was enough, more than enough, for everything it was. Later, in the car going home, his hand over hers in the dark, the city moving past the windows in its ambient unresting light, Bailey thought about the night that had started this. The stumble and the laughter and the long walk to a bar she'd never reached. The man who hadn't laughed. The card with only a phone number. The 6 days she'd held it before calling. She thought about how the worst moments had a way of being precise, of finding the exact fault line in a life and pressing on it until it cracked open and showed what was underneath. She had been cracked open in a ballroom in front of people who expected to find nothing worth noticing. She had found, underneath, herself. Exactly herself, stubborn and capable and unwilling, finally, to perform smallness for rooms that required it. She had also found him. Which was not something she had been looking for, and was therefore, she was coming to understand, exactly what it meant. He was watching the city too, his profile quiet and familiar in the way of things that had been looked at long enough to simply exist, no longer requiring interpretation. Next year, she said. He turned to her. Next year, she said again, we go early and we stay late and we do not apologize for a single moment of it. He considered this. We never apologized for a single moment of it, he said. She thought about it. He was right. Good, she said. Let's keep it that way. His hand tightened over hers. Small, unhurried, certain. The city kept moving. The night kept opening. And Bailey Whitmore, Bailey Azerov, rode through it with the particular ease of a woman who has survived the room that was supposed to diminish her and discovered, in the surviving, that she was significantly larger than the room had ever imagined. Hi, my loves. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this one. I know it was a long journey, and I want you to know that means everything to me. I want to be honest with you about this story, because you deserve that. When I started writing Bailey, I wasn't thinking about romance first. I was thinking about a feeling that I suspect a lot of you know, that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being excellent in rooms that have already decided what to think of you. The way you have to make yourself small in spaces that were not designed with you in mind, and the enormous amount of energy that costs, and how almost no one around you sees it. Bailey is not a victim in this story. That was the most important thing to me. She is a woman who survives a bad night and then keeps living, precisely, professionally, honestly, and finds something extraordinary not because she was rescued, but because she refused to make herself small for a room that wanted her to. Tamor, I love writing men like Tamor. Men who are not performing strength, because they are simply not afraid of what it costs them to be decent. The moment he sat down beside her was not about power. It was about choosing. I think choosing, knowing the cost, knowing the complications, and choosing anyway, is one of the most romantic things a person can do. If this story found you at a moment when you needed to be reminded that you are enough for any room, I hope it landed. If it found you at a moment when you're thinking about the complicated people in your life and the complicated feelings you have about them, I hope it gave you something to think about that isn't simple, because you deserve complexity, not easy answers. And if it just found you on a quiet evening looking for something to feel, I hope it delivered. I hope you felt something real. I'll be back with more. I'm always back with more, because these stories, your response to them, the comments you leave, the messages you send, they are genuinely the best part of what I do. Until next time, take care of yourselves.